So many kind of wheels within wheels and permutations here. This is pretty mind-boggling, really, isn't it? The idea that the BBC journalists at Newsnight were already investigating allegations about the behaviour of Hugh Edwards before The Sun published a word.
Yes, I heard that earlier yesterday, and I understand from good sources that it's absolutely true that a Newsnight team were looking at this. In some ways, Vanessa, it reminds me of a story that I was involved in exposing years ago with another leading BBC personality, Frank Boff.
Oh, yes.
Which involved, cocaine, sex orgies, prostitutes. But there, when we broke the story, or as we broke the story, we had a flood of people coming forward within the BBC, junior staff, saying how they'd been, in some cases, groped or propositioned, and they hadn't reported it because the power complex Frank Boff was in fact the Hugh Edwards of his day, the front man for BBC
Absolutely.
News.
Just in case people listening are too young to remember him, or for some reason don't remember him, shall I have a bash at explaining what his kind of role was?
Sure.
He was avuncular. He was kind of the nation's uncle in a certain way. He looked a little like Val Doonican used to look in a Fair Isle jumper. And
who's Val Doonican?
You don't know who's Val Doonican? Val Doonican was a singer who used to sit in a rocking chair and sing very reassuring kind of Irish-based folk songs of a lovely kind, and it was all very wholesome. And Frank Boff was kind of the news equivalent of that. He looked like your favourite uncle, genial and charming. He was often on television with his wife Nesta, always referred to as his lovely wife Nesta, and the two of them would go on a holiday on the Norfolk Broads or something, and the whole country would watch them on this holiday. And he was the absolute picture of respectability, happy marriage, and a very calm, reassuring news authority, wasn't he?
Yes.
And therefore, the difference between the life he was leading in private and the life he appeared to be leading in public was absolutely cataclysmic when that news story broke.
Exactly, and that's the parallel here. Because Hugh Edwards, by virtue of his position, even though there's no illegality involved, as there wasn't with Frank Boff, there was a question of immorality, hypocrisy, and whether the image presented to the public, both in the BBC, of course, so the taxpayer-funded broadcaster, that had to be exposed, I think. And not only that, the BBC fired Frank Boff very, very quickly, afterwards, because you're compromised. Hugh Edwards, who I admire as a broadcaster, but how could he possibly now go back to his old role? How could he interrogate politicians, business figures, regulators, trade union leaders, whose own standards may be at the centre of a controversial story? How could he do it? His credibility to do that is now shot, sadly.
Absolutely. And we focus very, very much, haven't we, on what has happened, what people have said, what has been done. But what we haven't focused very much on is what has not been said. And one of the things that has not been said is Hugh Edwards or his lawyer or his wife coming forward and saying Hugh is innocent, he didn't do any of these things, he hasn't had contact with any of these people, he's never messaged any of these young men, he's never sent compromising messages to anyone at work. I mean, there's been no protestation of or declaration of innocence at all so far.
No,
none, and there could have been. And neither has there been any kind of comment from his wife saying, and when Hugh's mental health is restored and when he comes out of hospital, we will be vigorously contesting these untrue and unfair allegations. They could have said that.
No,
they haven't said that.
The only thing that has been said was, and I don't know who filed it, but
on behalf of one of the young men saying
but on behalf on Hugh Edwards' own site, there was a reference to that their lawyers will be looking at possible libel over the original story. Now, I think last night I predicted on another channel that the Media Select Committee would get involved, although I did say I thought it would be straight after the summer recess. Well, I think they're going to have a fuller hearing, in which I think the BBC and The Sun will be grilled, or executives will be called and grilled. But they obviously decided they've got to do something a bit more urgently, so they've got a, if you like, a prelude by calling Tim Davie before them on Tuesday.
Yeah, but this is the proverbial toothless shark, isn't it? Even if he is called, and even if they skewer him with appalling accusations, nothing ever happens, does it?
Well, it depends. depends. Well, it depends.
When have they ever called anyone to one of these select committees and they've lost their job, or they've had to walk the plank, or the nation has hurled rotten tomatoes at them? Nothing ever happens.
Well, you could argue Boris Johnson might not agree with that, but in
Well,
fact, you know.
well,
But anyway,
I think that was after the event,
yeah.
wasn't it?
Well, yes, true.
Yeah.
True.
And didn't precipitate the
True.
thing either.
But I think, but
I mean, I think one of the people who said something pretty pertinent so far is Emily Maitlis, and Emily Maitlis said, "If you don't want to be the story, don't be the story." In other words, you know, if you don't want papers to write about your behaviour, if you don't want Newsnight to investigate your behaviour, if your behaviour isn't commensurate with the person that you're projecting yourself to be on the television, then don't do it. Don't behave in that way.
But Emily Maitlis also said something I disagree with, which she suggested that the story wasn't in the public interest. Now, I'm somebody who believes that the pendulum on privacy has swung too far against a free press. I'm not sure whether this is one of the classic examples of that, but I do think this was in the public interest. Whatever the question marks there may be about the way the Sun handled it, and I think there are questions for the Sun to answer about yesterday's statement, obviously carefully crafted by a lawyer, sort of rejected that there'd been any, shall we say, suggestion of potential illegality. If you read the first story, and if you read at least one of the headlines, it certainly gave the impression that this began when the young person involved was 17, and
yes.
That would be a clear breach of the 1978 Protection of the Children Act, for which, if you're found guilty, carries several years imprisonment. So, but the Sun then backed away from that. But their statement was curious because it blamed other media for picking up that line or running with a line that they said they didn't actually imply.
Well, you could say the whole
funnily enough,
you could say that line was more of a question than a statement. You could say that the parents of this young man said it had been going on for 3 years. He's now 20. He was 17 then. Now, the parents could have said it and it could have slightly got the timings wrong, or, you know, the Sun didn't declare it to be
that headline heavily inferred it. But anyway, but you've got a situation, but by blaming everybody else in the media, you know, the Sun's statement implied that these Times and Sunday Times, its own stablemates, you know, were among those who had actually somehow propagated this idea that the Sun say they didn't. So this is very curious.
Is it being seriously argued by anybody today that this was a private matter, and that as the law doesn't appear to have been broken, the story shouldn't have been broken? Is that being seriously suggested by anybody?
Yes, it is. I don't agree with that, but I was involved in a major phone-in programme on this, you know, yesterday, and the callers were about 50-50, saying this is his private life, it's got nothing to do with us, we don't need to know, and others saying it very much has. So I think,
I mean,
public opinion is balanced. It's not clear-cut.
Isn't one of the components here that if you want to keep your private life private, but part of your private life involves sending money, and I'm not saying he did it, but this is the allegation, sending money to a variety of different young men, or consorting with young men for money that you pay them, as has been suggested during lockdown. It may turn out he didn't. But if you're doing that kind of thing, each time you reveal your identity to a young man who you don't really know and who you know gets paid for either photographs or meetings or whatever it is. So you might say it might be a young man of sort of dubious moral nature, a young man who doesn't know you, doesn't owe you anything, that you are paying money to for either sexual pictures or to see them or talk to them or see them naked or whatever it is you're doing. Each time you do that, surely you are massively jeopardizing your own privacy, because each time you do that and the person knows who you're not in disguise, you haven't hidden your name. You know, in one instance, we've actually seen the messages sent to a 17-year-old with kisses and hearts and everything on Instagram, quite clear who the messages are from. Each time you do that and you entrust a total stranger who's young and in pursuit of money with your name and your identity, when you're actually a married man, you know, very, very senior in the Church of Wales, father of 5 children, etc., you know, how can you possibly not think you're jeopardising your own privacy?
I agree. It was, if it's, as it appears
If
to
it's
be,
true,
it
of
is
course.
absolutely reckless
Exactly.
and stupid. But it probably also indicates, the state of mind of a very obviously confused man who's been the author of his own self-destruction in many ways, in the same way that Frank Boff was.